let me put this in perspective because you just opened a very interesting topic. There's lots and lots of problems with LA today, right? One of them is the one that you're just talking about, which is pretty much running out of land, right? And having to think completely differently than how we used to before. The question that I have for you is, what are the other problems that you could think of when LA comes to mind, right? I mean, I know that we have the homelessness problem, which is a big problem that everybody avoids to talk about, but it continues to grow and expand and becomes bigger and bigger. We have downtown Los Angeles, which happens to be shifting now from one area to the other. If you noticed in the past couple of years, all the new developments are happening somewhere towards, I
The
think,
Arts District.
southwest. Yeah, exactly. Some other
Oh no,
district in
you mean when you say southwest, do you mean around the Staples
southwest.
Center, or do you
Yeah,
mean
exactly.
southeast, close to,
No,
in the Arts
Staples Center,
District?
Staples Center area, that area which has been witnessing a lot of new high-rise building and developments. Every time I pass by, I see all these new buildings coming up, right? And just towers. And we're thinking vertically. We used to think horizontally before when it comes to residential. I see more and more residences being built. That's probably a third problem, which is tied to the first, running out of land. People are finally starting to think that maybe we should build vertically versus horizontally, and consume less land and have more single families sitting in the same lot area. So there's just plenty of problems out there. But I want to hear you out. What do you think are the most top three, four, five pressing problems Los Angeles is facing today? What's your take on them?
Well, before I answer that, just tell me more about you and sort of what what your role is in this arena. We haven't even really talked about that. You introduced me at great length, but you didn't tell me much about you. So I want to know more about you. So then I know sort of what it is you're looking for in these answers.
I'm not an architect and I'm not a politician. I'm an engineer. I graduated in a bachelor's in electrical engineering and I pursued a master's in electrical engineering in Cal State, Los Angeles as well. So I lived in Los Angeles for quite a good period of time. I took multiple jobs overseas, local, been to more than 29 countries, uh, primarily as a technologist. I work in technology. We enable companies, architecture and engineering companies, to produce and deliver all the creative work that you see by offering them the right technology and tools that they need to do so. Uh, and we have the show where we talk to specifically architecture, engineering, construction influencers and leaders in the industry to talk about what's going on in the industry and how these different cities are coming across challenges and problems that they face regularly within that particular industry. You need to know more. I could be more than happy to dive more.
That's fine because you know, given, I mean, the electrical engineers are the future, you know. I mean, you're the ones that are going to figure out the energy issue. And I will say, you know, a minor problem that I see, this is a small problem, not a big problem, but a small problem, I think, is that LA modeled a pattern of housing design that was predicated on passive ventilation and situating buildings, you know, in harmony with prevailing winds and the topography. And we sort of gave up on doing that. And now we're going very tall and we're building these glass towers in a hot city like Los Angeles. And we're pumping them filled with, you know, with 24/7 AC. And I think that's a problem, but it's not maybe one of the bigger problems. I think that you just mentioned the towers in downtown. We are concentrating density and residential development in downtown because it's one of the places politically where it is more acceptable to build at scale, because so many parts of Los Angeles that want to hold on to the Garden City have precluded a really high level of density. So it's all going into downtown, and a lot of it is taking the form of these all glass clad towers. And to be honest, I wonder, again, this is not the big problem, it's maybe a smaller problem, but we're building these kind of generic towers that could be in Toronto or Vancouver as much as in Los Angeles. And I'd like to ask you, how could we make one of the things that Ella was so wonderful about Los Angeles and so appealing to people over many decades was it did have a very distinct character. It was hard to tell when you flew in and you looked down at a whole bunch of concrete freeways. But once you got on the ground and you went to all these different areas, whether it was Pasadena or Santa Monica or Torrance or Pomona or wherever it was, each had its own character. They were developed in different decades. The influence of the Hollywood and sort of a level of ambition that LA kind of enabled produced very produced local styles, that really gave LA a very particular flavor. And right now, I think a lot of the stuff that we're building doesn't have a local flavor. It feels rather generic and like it could be anywhere America or even anywhere in the world. And I do think that's sort of a great pity, actually. LA is becoming globalized. Many of the firms in the architecture and construction realm, they are global companies. We have global investors coming into LA and developing in those areas like you just mentioned. So I must say, I would love for there to be a little bit of a conversation about in a globalized world, how do we keep some level of regional character? And that applies to all the other globalized cities, by the way. It also applies to London. It also applies to Dubai. It applies to this world that we live in generally. That is how do you stay local while being global?
That's the problem. Many of my guests, when they join, I ask them about problems that they see today or challenges they see in the industry, and many of them avoid this particular answer. So I encourage them to do so. But I can answer that. I can say that probably they can't. I think it's the developers. It's primarily developers, the guys with the money who are dictating how they want things to run and grow and be built. Because at the end of the day, we are part of that ecosystem. We are a chain, a major link in the chain, but we're not the chain. We're not the primary founder of that particular ecosystem. I think it's developers who move in, and developers are usually mostly driven by financial metrics, right? They want to make, obviously, they're for-profit organizations and developments, and they want to make sure that they make as much return on these developments as possible. And gone with the wind are things like you're talking about, preserving the character and identity of a specific city or a specific region or area, in exchange of higher profitable developments and projects. Do you agree that that's a problem we're facing today, or that's imposing its weight on LA, or no?
Well, I think LA has been driven by development. I think real estate development is the mother's milk of Los Angeles,
Mm.
and it has been, again since the founding of the City of Angels. But certainly it and you would know better than I, but it does seem, at least I'm told, that there's been a shift in terms of the type of developer, as in the relative numbers, I guess, of sort of mom and pop developers who were invested in the town. This was their town. This is where they built, and perhaps did have perhaps more of a sort of an attachment to the region. And now you have more of the big conglomerates, that perhaps don't have that same attachment to the region, and are building as much in Houston as they are in Los Angeles, as they are in San Francisco. And so in that sense, I'm I don't feel like I'm fully the expert on the movements of development capital, but that's what I sense from hearing from other people about this, and from what I see, what I see being built. But then I think, yes, up to a point it's the developers, but also municipalities are able to exercise certain controls over things. I mean, they could, if the municipalities could change the code if they wanted to say, we want a certain, they have code on setbacks, they have code on open space, they have code on all sorts of aspects of a building. If they wanted to, they could build in code on, we want our buildings to we're going to prioritize passive cooling over mechanical cooling. I know that sounds kind of cranky and outmoded these days, but I truly think that if they prioritized passive cooling, we would have buildings that looked different and felt different.
So you're not very happy with the way that things are taking direction right now. What inspired you to write Common Ground Multifamily Housing in Los Angeles? What was the main driver behind that book?
Well, there were two or three main drivers behind that book, which were that I was at KCRW, and they were personal and professional. So professionally, there I was working at KCRW covering design and architecture in LA, and also current affairs, because I'd worked on WUAEC for so many years, which was a current affairs discussion program and looked at all aspects of challenges at Los Angeles was facing. And increasingly, housing became an issue. And as it developed as an issue, you saw more and more people advocating for greater density. And by more and more, I mean elected officials, I mean planners, I mean architects, I mean developers. And you also saw pushback against that. So back around 2016 was when I really started to get really interested in this issue, when two anti-density measures appeared on the ballot. One was Measure S in Los Angeles, and one was Measure LV in Santa Monica. Both of them, as I say, anti-density measures. Both of them ultimately failed. However, they didn't quash the anti-density kind of generalized sort of pushback. But even during those anti-density, even during the fight over those measures, I saw something happening, which was a lot of people who were advocating for more housing at greater density didn't themselves model that lifestyle. So I saw a whole cohort of people making the case for density, but not themselves modeling that lifestyle, because the single family home was the ideal. And it became more and more apparent to me that it was really difficult to kind of win a political battle around density if even the advocates themselves didn't live that way. But meanwhile, I myself did live that way, because I myself happened to live in a 6-unit apartment building. Now, this was not a tower. It was not very high density. It was low rise density, but still I was living in a rental apartment building, i.e., I was living what was being advocated for, which was kind of more rental apartment living. And by the way, I was living that way in part because I actually really loved our building. However, I had a daughter who was going through high school, who was meeting all her peer group, who were all living in the California dream, the single family home. And she expressed great consternation that she too didn't live like this. Like, what were we doing in living in a rental apartment, and how upsetting this was that we had not somehow achieved this kind of expected way of life in Los Angeles. And so I had these two things coming at me. This, as I say, I witnessed this kind of this kind of mixed message around advocacy around density, which is sort of do as I say, but not as I do. And then within my own family, I was experiencing the stigmatization. I was seeing my daughter feel the sting of the stigma around rental apartment living. So I just thought, I want to take this on. I want to understand why this stigma exists. I want to make the case that the only way to sort of win the politics around this is with a carrot, not a stick. And the carrot is to say that rental apartment living actually can be great. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish because I understand the limitations. I do. But I wanted to say that LA has this amazing legacy of multifamily living in LA that has been kind of marginalized over the years, and I wanted to surface that
Did it change
multifamily.
since 2016, Frances? Did it change? Did the mood change? Did the direction change since 2016 in favor of multifamily housing, apartment living, any of that?
Well, obviously, since really the aughts, more and more apartments were going up, and not all of them were that appealing. And that was the other thing. People were seeing these generic medium rise buildings going up, and they weren't liking them. And what they weren't seeing, because those buildings were kind of front and center as you were starting to drive around Los Angeles and see this density going up by, alongside or part and parcel of an emerging mass transit system, which is part of the story here. The 21st century in LA has been about Back to the Future, recreating a mass transit system, and part and parcel of that mass transit system is medium rise, mid rise, and higher rise housing, and that has been a source of kind of anxiety and conflict. And we're in a state of transition. It's not an easy one. It has pitted an old lifestyle against a new lifestyle. The new lifestyle, which is kind of live close to transit. You don't need to have parking spaces. It's a whole new kind of urban lifestyle, but that doesn't really fully work yet because that's not how LA is. It's the transit system doesn't get you everywhere. It invariably you can't live a fully, most people are not able to live a fully transit-based lifestyle. There are certainly some who are making that work, but for many it doesn't work that way. So, or you might have people, choosing to go and live close to transit in Culver City or downtown, but then still have the car and not actually live that transit lifestyle.
How do you think we should solve it? How do you think we should move from here?
Well,
if it's not the high-rise residential buildings, if it's passive cooling versus mechanical cooling, if it's what is it then?
Well, I think it's time. I think we're just in a state of transition. I think the transit system will build out. And as it builds out, it will become more viable for more people. And with that, and I think we are in a process of building greater density closer to transit. It's not at scale yet, but 50 years from now it will be. I do wonder about what kind of region we're going to have sort of physically if we hold on to these vast swaths of single family residential, and then we build out the thoroughfares. We over the last century had built out Wilshire. There were certain thoroughfares that were built up, but most were not. Now they're being built up. And what are we going to end up with? Like all these arterials that have got one layer deep of 6, 8 even more stories high, and then it's like a stage set, and sort of behind it you go back down to very low rise. It's a very odd urban pattern. I don't know that there's a model for that, really. Can you think of a city anywhere in the world that has that kind of development pattern, where the thoroughfares are towers, and then, or towering, and then in between you have these patches of large patches of kind of garden city living?
Think of a city of the same nature? Not really.
I can't think of one, but that seems to be the way that currently LA is headed. Now, back to the passive cooling, which you probably think I'm like a nutcase
You
to
think
be
it will
going on
exist? I'm
about.
sorry, before we get to cooling, you think it will continue to exist for the future? Because these houses, they keep appreciating in price, right? So I can't think of a developer wealthy enough to move into a full block and take it out, rip it apart, and build apartments instead.
Well, they're not allowed to. They're not allowed to go
They're
into
not even
these.
allowed to.
No. I mean, all the R1 neighborhoods completely exclude that. And there have been efforts at the state level to upzone, but they have been met with tremendous resistance. It is politically extremely unpalatable to propose upzoning. And to the
How will
to
we
the point,
solve how will we solve the housing problem then? If we
well,
cannot upzone and there's a lot of political influence
well,
opposing the
people
efforts.
will people I mean, currently there's two answers. One answer is young families can't buy a house in LA. They want the house, and
Mm.
they move. They move to Texas. They move to North Carolina, as people have been doing.
Which is
They move
happening,
to
yes, true.
Nevada. That is happening. Or or they accept that there is a different model for tomorrow, which is the apartment or the condo on the thoroughfare, and that's going to be the housing option, unless they're doing extremely well
Mm,
and can buy a house that costs them more than $1 million. Because I
correct.
think we're nearly at, I think the average house price in LA is now nearly $1 million.